Paula, thank you so much for your very interesting speech. You were instrumental in creating the SDGs. Now, 2 years into agenda, the world looks different. What do you feel is the main challenge, the main risk for not completing the 2030 agenda?
I think it's what I mentioned at the beginning of my intervention, which is the inertia that is in the system, the kind of complacency, the sense of that things are reversible. We are lulled by our very human ingenuity, creativity, and innovation into thinking that we can somehow find a technological fix that will get us out of these issues. We're starting to hear, for example, a lot of conversations about geoengineering and other ways of tackling the climate divide, the climate issue, without really looking at first at driving down emissions through sectoral approaches, which is with technologies that we already know are there and that are technically feasible, that are economically feasible. So I think that that's really one of the biggest challenges and one of the biggest threats to the delivery of this agenda is moving away from a business as usual approach. And linked to that is what I was saying about the long-term perspective. We're used to working in cycles of 4 years, maximum 6 years, budget cycles, election cycles. And what we're looking at here is the need to start to think about 2050 now. I call it 2050s now because it's about how we get decision makers at all levels to understand that the decisions they take now are what's going to be defining what the world looks like in 2050. And that's a hard message to get through when people are really looking on delivering either budgets or profits for the now.
Jon, you have been around for some years to make people think other than business as usual. That's easier said than done.
Yes, it is easier said than done. But what are we talking about? We're talking about taking these 17 seriously. And we're talking about achievable amounts of resources. And some people are engaged in calculating what would it actually cost, hypothetically, to eradicate global poverty. And it is actually achievable. There's nothing that would prevent us as a global community from mobilizing the resources that is necessary to bring every citizen on the globe above the global minimum poverty line. And the financial means are there. The institutional mechanisms are not quite there. So I think an important part of the equation, the challenge that we need to face is how do we get national governments like ourselves, even more national governments in developing countries, but also our multilateral system to be geared towards delivering of this. So I think there is it's achievable, but there are some systemic design challenges that I think we need to face if we're going to succeed.
This sounds pretty optimistic.
I am a born optimist.
Yes? Are you as optimistic, Homi?
I'm always optimistic, but sometimes facts have an unfortunate way of getting in the mood of that optimism. So one of the things that's quite disturbing is that we were really hoping that with the SDGs we would get off to a flying start. You know, we had the MDGs already underway. There was a lot of momentum that had built up. People were talking about the successes of development. And now the first numbers come out. We have more people living in hunger for the first time. Carbon emissions are starting to go up again. You look at one of the things we championed in the SDGs that Paula brought onto the table very forcefully was oceans. You look at what's happening to the state of the oceans and to many of our natural resources. They're all moving in the wrong direction. So we're struggling a little bit that we've got this bold, grand vision, but reality is actually moving in the, not just that we're going too slowly, in some places we're actually going in the wrong direction.
Let's continue with you, Homi, and talk about poverty, because poverty has a much darker future as you see it, I understand. You're talking about persistent poverty, stubborn poverty. How does the aid community have to change its ways to fight that?
Well, we'll talk a little bit more about this later, but I think that when we were striving, as Jan said, we were able to reduce global poverty by half. It was a wonderful achievement. But it all happened in some big, large countries, mostly in Asia. And what's disturbing is that in so many countries, progress on poverty reduction was actually almost nothing over a 20-year period. So at the same time as celebrating the global reductions in poverty, we have to worry about the fact that there were many, many places where we simply have not had real success. And if we're going to achieve the SDGs, which talk about ending poverty everywhere, then we really have to focus on those sets of countries. And they are more and more concentrated in sub-Saharan Africa. They have certain features which we'll talk about later. But there are really, a few places where we have to figure out something different, because what we're doing now just isn't working on the scale and the trajectories that we really want.
Paula, do you also see the change on on poverty?
Do I see change on poverty?
Yeah, the picture Homi is giving us now, where poverty has another face than it had before.
Well, I don't think it has another face. I think that, I think if I can paraphrase what Homi said, some of the low-hanging fruit of the possibility of poverty reduction has been done. And now we're faced with both places where there's entrenched poverty, where people have always been left behind. When I was at the bank, at the World Bank, I was the global director for the energy and, for the environment and natural resource global practice. And I always used to say, if you care about poverty, to come to me, I'll tell you where they are. I'll tell you where the entrenched poverty is, because a lot of it are really very marginalized rural communities. More and more, the agenda is becoming an urban one. But these are communities that haven't been taken up by the sort of trickle-down economics that we expect. And I think something else, when I was talking about the need to rebalance growth models, that sense that we can just grow and that somehow everybody will be brought up, exactly the kind of narrative we're seeing right now in the United States, is false, because it's predicated on a massive overconsumption of natural resources, which is, again, what I think Homi was alluding to. And we need to balance that. How are we going to deal with the poverty, with the expectations of this global middle class, with the carbon budget, and with the fact that we're deteriorating our resources, whether it's oceans, soils, water, at unsustainable rates. So how that all adds up means that it's going to be much harder to tackle the poverty that remains, and also to avoid having people fall back into poverty or experience poverty that haven't done so in the past. It really is a whole of system approaches, and a lot of leadership and vision will be needed.
The low-hanging fruit has been taken?
Yeah, part of what we're discussing now is, of course, how do we balance my inherent optimism and the crude realism of facts and figures, and we have to balance them. But I am convinced that we will not succeed if we do not manage to convince each other that success is possible. I think that we need to convince each other that success is possible, and success is possible. That doesn't mean it's easy. That doesn't mean that the second half of the poverty challenge will be much more challenging. I mean, a lot of what we have achieved was achieved through the old way, the well-known way of economic transformation, industrialization, urbanization, the way societies and economies have been transformed and poverty have been reduced in our part of the world. That's what happened in the big Asian economies. That will still happen. And I fundamentally believe that East Africa will go that route. It will do it in a slightly different way from what we would like sometimes, but it will do it in its way. And then we have a different set of challenges related to parts of West Africa, parts of Central Africa, where extremely weak states, for different reasons, is what we work with. And we don't have we don't have all the answers to what is one of the big questions clearly is what will be the respective roles of different agents of change in those societies. What will be the role of government? What will be the role of civil society? What will be the role of private sector? And will we see development models that challenge our perception of what the way development would? We come from a very government-centric type of development tradition. And it's not obvious that the development trajectory in some of these societies will be in that way. And then we must not allow ourselves that the big picture is that there's 30-odd countries that are struggling. But then we have groups also in countries that are succeeding, that are not that are not benefiting from the transformation, and then to find ways of supporting the battle against poverty for marginalized groups also in middle-income countries will continue to be part of the agenda if we're going to arrive at as close to zero as possible.
How does it change? The aid agencies have to change in this picture.
Well, I think lots of people have talked about the catalytic role of aid. One of the things that we're seeing is that actually there's not that much difference between the success rate of aid projects in different places across the world. Aid agencies are actually quite good at having successful projects. The problem is to take the lessons of those successful projects and really make them transformational. And in reasonably well-functioning countries, you get either the government driving that transformation based on the lessons that it learns from these projects, or you get the private sector doing that transformation. In some places, neither of those mechanisms works. And then you need to have other kinds of mechanisms. So we almost have this strange, micro-macro paradox where at a micro level you can do an evaluation of an aid project and say, well, actually, it's reasonably successful and it met its objectives. But aid is small. And so if you just meet the objectives of a project, you're not achieving the kind of transformation that you really need to achieve. And the bigger question then is, how do we get that kind of big transformation? And I think just one other thing, I think what Jan said about the subnational level is just so important now. I mean, we've always really dealt with these ideas of countries growing and country performance and country averages. And it's not about that any longer. It's really about these different places that are struggling. And, those maps that Paula put up at the end of her presentation with the, that visualize exactly where development progress is happening. It's so powerful, it's so easy to see that, yes, progress is happening here, but it really isn't happening there. And reaching into those places and those communities is a very different way of actually approaching aid. It means people have to get out a little bit more into the field.
More in the field. Paula, one question for you, and for you, the others too. The international news arena seems to go around very fast now. There are kind of shocking news every day with Donald Trump in the White House. There are big stories running headlines that usually was 2.5 years. Now it's a couple of them every day. How does this, what impact does this have on the SDG agenda? Do people kind of get overwhelmed and there is no use in working for good things coming in 2020, in 2030? Or do they get more enthusiastic?
Well, I think that this, when I see the direction of travel in some parts of the world and what's happening, and more polarization, more populism, a greater sense of threats that everybody seems to be perceiving, I'm more convinced than ever that the SDGs were exactly the right agenda and the right vision that we needed. It's going to be very difficult to deliver on it, but I completely agree with John that that this is the agenda that we need to struggle for and that we need to strive for and that needs to be delivered. And the reason for it is quite simple, is the fact that you start to see with the layout, even when you just look at all these colorful cubes or however the visuals are, of looking at the whole of development. And sometimes, we get often criticized, 17, it's too much, 160, what, it's ridiculous. But that shows you not just the complexity of development, but the potential. And you have a minister of transport in a middle-income country, or a minister of agriculture in a low-income country, or a captain, a titan of industry. All of them, just by having the fact of the visuals, of the understanding of the SDG agenda, changes their understanding of what it is that needs to be done. Even if they're not doing it, the paradigm shift in terms of the concept, the visuals of the direction of travel has changed entirely. Imagine a world with all of these dramas that you've just said that are playing out at just such whip speed, without the SDGs, without having a referent of saying, yes, all of this is happening, but this is actually the right direction of travel. This is what we have to deliver on. To me, I find enormous comfort in just having that agenda and having those reference as something that we're all accountable for. And the fact that it is universal and the fact that we're bringing in private sector, subnational actors, that everybody's starting to feel that they have a piece of the action, to me, that is what's going to really tip the balance, because it's too much, we can't afford to fail, we're too big to fail. And the SDGs are shining a light on the ways to make that possible. So I'm more encouraged than ever and more convinced than ever.
Is 17 a lot? I think Homi at a dinner yesterday evening asked a very simple question. Tiny little Norway, how many ministries do we have? 17, it so happens. So it means that in order to solve the very small problems that we have in our very small country, we need 17 ministries. So what is it that should lead us to believe that in order to solve the major global challenges, we need fewer? And I think that so 17 is not a lot. The world doesn't always move forward in a smooth and sort of calm and smooth way, and we see backlashes. We see backlashes in important areas, and we have to fight it. Last 2 weeks ago, I was in Uganda, and I had many wonderful experiences. One terrible experience I had was when I was at a hospital where they were giving sexual education to young girls with difficulties, and was told that in order to that the message they were allowed to give to them was abstinence, the solution to their problems. And I couldn't resist the temptation to say to the hospital director that I was very happy that it wasn't me who had to talk about abstinence to a raped young girl. So clearly, these other forces are there. What can we do? Continue the struggle. Sort of keep focusing and not give in. And then on the bigger issue, you could say that the challenging, but also at the same time, I wouldn't say important dimension of the remaining poverty challenges from a European perspective is that it brings the remaining global poverty to our neighborhood. I mean, the fact that over the next 20 years we'll see a massive Africanization of global poverty means that global poverty, the outstanding global poverty, is quite close to home. And that also needs to become, in an enlightened way, part of our conversation and our narrative. Not in a simplistic way, not in an anti-foreign way, but in a mature and real way, that is actually part of the story, that the common destiny that people on both sides of the Mediterranean have to deal with.
But Homi, you are living in in Washington D.C. in the middle of everything. The SDGs require some enthusiasm. And it's an unpredictable world when a lot of strange things happen. Will that make people paralyzed and not work for the SDGs?
Actually, and here's my little dose of optimism, I think it's actually the opposite.
So all three of you are big optimists.
One of there are two things which I think have lead me to say this. One is this notion of universality. A lot of what we see in Washington and other places around the world is that everyone is actually faced with the same kinds of problems about sustainable development. Some of them are domestic, some of them have global spillovers, but everyone faces those problems and issues. I think that is fundamentally a good thing, because it means that this idea that somehow there are some places that have sort of got it all right and they have, the right answer that they just simply need to transmit to the rest of the world, that's no longer really tenable. Everybody's starting to understand that every society needs to address these issues on their own terms and come up with their own solutions. And the second reason for optimism, I think, is that people are starting to realize that they're going to have to take responsibility themselves for their own development. It's not going to be handed to them on a plate by somebody else. Those days are really gone. Yes, there'll be a tremendous role for cooperation and assistance and solidarity, but the idea that you can just sit back and wait and some big power is going to come in and solve your development problem, I don't think anybody thinks that any longer. That ultimately is really going to be, I think, a strong driver of development. And for the first time, we really see this idea that countries are in the driver's seat starting to get some traction.
I think this will be the last word of this conversation. The time for sit back and wait for someone to solve your problems, this time is over. Thank you so much. We go back and find our seats in the...